for dark nights.
Seven Symphonies Circus by Shenoa, Carroll, Brad. The world's fattest man awoke in a dark corner of a rattling train car, smelling straw, rust, and rot. An elongated box was against the opposite wall, draped in a tarpaulin, lit by flickers of passing light from the cracks around the door. There was one like it in each of the boxcars shrouded from the sunlight. Dr. Madness, the ringmaster, never put all his eggs in one basket. He was far too wily a bastard for that. The world's fattest man shifted, feeling sweat pool among his many rolls. He had no way of knowing which one of Madness's helpers was in the coffin, but the fact that it was in there with him at all made his skin crawl. He stretched as much as he could, feeling the press of humidity in the boxcar. He wondered what new mark they were steaming toward this time. Madness never let him go in the advance party, arriving a day ahead of the circus to spread flyers and drum up interest. Madness sent younger boys, and Cyrene, the snake dancer. Cyrene always drew them in. He imagined her parading down the street in her spangly outfit, one of her boas asleep on her shoulders. The world's fattest man was too cumbersome, too inconvenient, to ever go on ahead. He had to be hauled in and out of the boxcar with a series of platforms and pulleys, like a wounded elephant. "Crawl, elephant boy," the others teased. "Show us your little trunk." He shook his head. It hadn't always been like this. Madness made him into a freak. The world's fattest man had a name once, Alfred Nocher. Back in 1910, before he joined the Seven Symphonies Circus, he'd been 16 and husky. His life at the time had seemed limited. Go to college and try to find a career, or follow in his father's footsteps and learn household carpentry. Neither option had appealed to him, and he thought he'd be happier if he could just cut ties to his former life altogether. The Seven Symphonies Circus had come through the neighboring town of Drayville, and he'd gotten it in his head that he was meant for a life on the road. He'd read Leaves of Grass 3 times and thought that maybe he could travel the world, writing poetry and sipping from Lady Luck's cup. After the show, he'd approached the circus owner, Dr. Thaddeus Madness, with his hat in hand, sweat on his still hairless lip. As Alfred walked up to the ringmaster, Madness's face had changed, his broad lips breaking into a grin that showed every tooth. That close, Alfred had been able to see the cracks and streaks in Madness's makeup, the ravages of sweat and time. "My boy," Madness said, clapping his shoulder. "Enjoyed the show, did you?" Yes, sir," Alfred muttered. Good, good. Be sure to tell your friends." He paused then, and had seemed to look Alfred over. Alfred hadn't met his eyes but for half a second at a time. "Oh my," the ringmaster had said. "I know that face. Yes, I do. Don't have many friends, do you?" Alfred had shaken his head. "No, sir." "Well, we can't have everything, can we, son?" Madness had leaned back and glared at him. "What can I do for you?" Alfred had crumpled his hat in his hands, unable to release it. Well, sir, I was hoping I could hire on with you for a spell. I know sums and cooking, and I can do hard labor." Madness had given him a skeptical look. "I know I don't look it, but I'm as hard a worker as you'll ever find." "How old are you, boy?" 18, sir." Madness had grinned at that, and Alfred worried if it had been because his voice had quavered at the lie. The ringmaster looked around the big top, and his smile had faded as he watched his worker's progress. "I can always use a hard worker," he grumbled. That was back before Madness had acquired his helpers, when setting up and striking the circus fell to human hands. Alfred glanced across the boxcar to the covered coffin once more. He didn't know where the helpers had come from, but being so close made him sick. He shuddered. It was probably his imagination, but he could smell its contents baking in the stifling heat. Madness had not asked any more questions that first night, which was a little disappointing because Alfred had prepared a whole story about how he was an orphan and no one would miss him. Instead, Madness had clapped him on the back and told him to report to Greenlee, a tall man in a slouchy gray hat. Madness had declared that night a trial run and said that if Alfred did a good job, they would discuss permanent employment. That had been the best night of Alfred's life. He'd sweated, broke brand new calluses on his palms, and had felt all the while like he had made it into the ranks of illustrious and magical people. He was happy. When the 7 Symphonies Circus left town 3 days later, Alfred went with them. Madness fed him well and provided him with a bunk. He'd assigned Alfred to help Greenlee with whatever was needed, but Alfred had caught Madness watching him sometimes, looking at him like a butcher would a hog. After learning what he could from Greenlee, he had been reassigned to study under Magno, the strong man. Alfred had eaten the same things as Magno: a dozen raw eggs, steak, rolls, mashed potatoes, several helpings of everything. Magno had lifted weights and exercised all day, but Alfred didn't. Alfred had just gotten fat. When he'd brought that up to Madness, the ringmaster had eyed him and nodded. "You do seem to have gained some weight," Madness had said. "Maybe strongman understudy isn't the best fit for you." A few days later, Madness had approached Alfred. "One of the freaks is sick," he had said. "Can you fill in for a few hours?" Alfred had been appalled, but he agreed. In hindsight, he'd wished he'd asked which freak. Madness and Greenlee had taken off Alfred's shirt and pants, then puffed gray powder on his skin and hooked a long fake nose onto his face.
"Your backstory is the elephant boy," Madness told him. "Abandoned as a child, you were raised in the wilds of Africa by a herd of elephants. Don't speak, don't get up off your hands and knees. You can trumpet if you want. Let me hear your trumpet."
Alfred had tried his best, but Madness winced. "No trumpeting, just tromp around in circles and eat some peanuts." "What peanuts?" "The ones folks'll throw," Greenlee had said. Alfred had looked pleadingly to Madness. "Sir?" Madness had waved a hand dismissing any further talk. "Pretend you're an elephant. Make it fun." They dragged him to the elephant boy's booth. "But no hands. Elephants don't have hands." Alfred dropped to his knees, wondering what his mother would say if she saw him there, crawling through the straw like an animal. Staring at the coffin, Alfred thought of his mother. He hadn't seen or heard from her since he signed up and didn't even know if she was still alive. The past 10 years had dragged on, and Alfred was tired. Tired of eating, tired of the stares, the mocking crowd, the disgusted noises women made under their breaths as they passed his stall. Alfred didn't speak much anymore, and people rarely spoke to him, rendering his tongue out of practice. After he reached a certain size, people stopped seeing him as anything other than a breathing collection of rolls and bulges. They seemed to forget he had ears, and as a result, he'd learned so much over the last decade. He was fed up with the secrets, the lies, and the deaths. Alfred made up his mind. He began rocking back and forth, trying to tip himself over. He succeeded, with a sound like a giant pancake being flipped onto a hot griddle. The coffin sat only 4 feet away. He started to crawl. After his first night as the elephant boy, Madness had raised his pay. He'd sworn that Alfred was the best he'd ever seen, but if he wanted to be truly great, he would need to put on more mass. Alfred occasionally wondered if his life would have turned out differently had he just said no. But he didn't say no, and Madness had assigned him weekly weight quotas to reach. He was restricted from any unnecessary movement. At first, it had been relaxing, like a paid vacation, but crawling around on his knees carrying all that weight had soon become painful. His knees grew swollen and red until Madness had stopped dusting him with gray powder and finally canceled the elephant boy. Soon after, Greenlee had given Alfred a chair. "Don't stop eating," Madness had said. "You'll be our biggest attraction." And just like that, Alfred became the great monstrosity, the world's fattest man. Alfred struggled forward, his flabby stomach dragging along the dirty, straw-covered bottom of the boxcar. He was coated in a sheen of sweat. His chest hurt, but he continued crawling forward an inch at a time, dragging himself by his huge, heavy arms, his legs trailing behind, just extra ballast. For a while, Alfred had been able to get around on a pair of heavy crutches. Madness scolded him, claiming he was doing harm and that he should let his legs rest. Alfred did not listen. He had enjoyed whatever slivers of freedom he could find. At one town stop, Madness had brought a physician in to perform a yearly physical exam of all the talent and crew. The doctor's breath reeked of gin. He had started with Alfred's reflexes and then weighed him. Alfred must have fallen asleep because the next thing he remembered was waking up to find the doctor gone. The backs of his ankles ached, but he'd grown too fat to see or reach them. Madness told him the doctor's orders were to stay off his feet for at least a month, otherwise it might result in permanent damage. He wouldn't say exactly what the doctor had done. Alfred's weight had swelled in the following weeks. His ankles itched and ached, driving him mad because he couldn't scratch them. When the time had finally come for Alfred to walk again, he'd fallen over immediately upon standing. He had called for help and Madness came. The ringmaster had shaken his head sadly. "You shouldn't have pushed yourself," he said. "Now look what you've done." Alfred had dreamed that if he just rested his legs long enough, they'd recover, and he'd be able to walk away from the Seven Symphonies circus. But deep down, he had known the truth. Madness would never let him leave. Madness had crippled him. Alfred inched closer and closer. His hand landed on the tarpaulin and pulled it away, revealing a coffin of dark, polished wood, carved and inscribed in a language he couldn't read. Once he was next to it, Alfred definitely smelled the corruption of the thing inside. It hadn't been his imagination. He slapped a flabby wing of an arm over the casket's lid and began the laborious crawl toward the boxcar door. Madness's helpers were one of the circus's many ugly secrets. Alfred knew how they went out into town whenever the circus stopped and preyed upon those who didn't come to see the show. Madness told them not to harm patrons, but the rest were fair game. He believed it was a small price for a circus ticket, a small price to save their lives. The casket was heavier than he'd expected, and Alfred's progress slowed down even more as he oozed across the boxcar floor. The way his heart fought in his chest, and as hard as it was to breathe, he didn't think he had much longer left. For a while, Madness used to bring him hired girls as a reward for a year's work well done. If sitting in a chair and stuffing his face while strangers sneered could have been considered work. He hadn't brought Alfred a girl in 3 years, not since he'd accidentally smothered one. He'd wondered if her family ever learned the truth of what had happened to her, or if one day the girl's mother had woken up with a hole in her life. Most likely, no one had learned of her demise. Madness's helpers probably saw to that. There was a popular snack booth by Cyrene's tent, and he could always smell it from his chair, the aroma of roasting meat and spices forever teasing his nose. The booth's painted sign had read, "Exotic morsels from the mysterious East," and he had often seen patrons wander by with skewers of spiced browned meat. Camel, the signs had claimed, but Alfred had never seen a live camel near the circus, let alone a cleaned and butchered one. When patrons had asked how the meat could be so fresh, they had been told it was owed to a secret preservation technique known only in the Orient and taught only to a dozen chefs a decade. Alfred had seen the helpers come stalking back through the fairgrounds after a kill flushed with life. He had known not to get close or to ask any questions. They had paid him no mind, but he'd overheard them speak of the angel. The angels' shows had all been in the big top, where Alfred hadn't been allowed, but he'd seen patrons exit with tears on their cheeks, smiling and laughing, as if they were drunk. Alfred wished he could see the angel perform. He'd have liked that almost as much as being able to walk again. Alfred reached the door and collapsed, his sweaty face pressed to the boxcar's filthy floor, his breath wheezing. He lay there for nearly 15 minutes, trying to regain his strength. His heart pounded against his ribcage so hard that he thought it might burst. At last, he pulled himself up and flipped the latch on the door. Once the top opened, he collapsed like a cresting wave of fat. Despite everything, Alfred had understood his place at the circus. He hadn't been so hopelessly naive. Madness had explained people flocked to his shows for 2 reasons, and 2 reasons only. The light. They'd come to see something amazing, something awe-worthy, something they'd never be able to do, something that filled them with wonder and hope and made them feel alive. That was Cyrene's job. That was the angel's dominion. And there was the dark, the ugly, the disgusting, the place where the misfortunate provided something hideous for the patrons to gawk at. The patrons wanted to feel superior. They wanted their little lives to look better by comparison to the disfigured, deformed, and wrong. Alfred had provided that service, faithfully and without complaint, for years. But no longer. Resting on his enormous stomach, Alfred pried the boxcar door open an inch. The wind whistled, blowing cool air on his face. He smiled. His suffering was not for nothing. He pried the door open a little more, then gripped the edge and pulled the creaking wood fully open, taking comfort in the knowledge that his soul would persist, unlike Madness's poor, damned helpers. The wind roared and sucked at him. The dry fields passed in a yellow blur. Alfred slapped one huge arm on the casket once more, making a sound like a slaughtered animal dropping to the floor. Something moved inside the coffin, then frantically scratched and pounded against the lid. Alfred took a deep, labored breath, then shoved the coffin out. It disappeared into the air, whipping out of sight. Alfred heard the crack of wood exploding into splinters on impact, and a horrible, inhuman screeching as Madness's helper was suddenly forced into the strong summer sunshine. Madness would hear it. Madness would know. Alfred dragged himself to the edge of the door. The train brakes squealed. He gripped the floor edge, then heaved himself out. He tumbled onto the weedy ground, feeling the gravel bite into his flesh, chewing him apart. He rolled down the embankment, the world going blurry. He'd done it. He was finally free. Alfred came to rest in a little culvert, where dirty water trickled around his swollen feet, and patches of wild mustard and black-eyed Susans bloomed. Pain burned throughout his body. Wide gashes seeped blood through the pockets of erupted fat. His ankles and knees had taken the worst, and he did not possess the strength to move another inch. The train brakes ceased squealing at last. Alfred closed his eyes and sighed. The breeze was nice. The air was warm but not hot, not suffocating like it had been in the boxcar. He heard shouting, swearing, the trample of feet. Madness was coming. Madness would kill him for what he had done. But for right then, Alfred was happy. He may not have walked away, but he'd managed to quit 7 Symphonies Circus after all.